Long before cities, before written language, and long before vast agricultural fields stretched across continents, the people of the Americas were learning how to transform the plants around them. One of the earliest of these plants was squash. Thousands of years ago, wild squash vines crept along the ground in warm valleys and forests from what is now Mexico down through Central and South America. These early squashes were very different from the ones we know today. Their fruits were small, bitter, and often too hard to eat. In fact, the flesh of wild squash was usually unpleasant and sometimes toxic. But the seeds inside the fruit were rich in oils and nutrients. For early foragers, these seeds were valuable food. People gathered the fruits, cracked them open, and roasted the seeds over fires. Over time, something remarkable began to happen. As people repeatedly collected squash plants with larger fruits or more seeds, they unintentionally began selecting certain plants over others. The process we now call domestication had begun. Archaeological evidence suggests that squash may have been one of the very first plants domesticated in the Americas, possibly as early as 10,000 years ago. Ancient remains of squash rinds and seeds discovered in caves in southern Mexico show clear signs that humans were already shaping the plant's evolution. Generation after generation, farmers saved seeds from the plants that produced the most useful fruits. The bitter chemicals that once protected wild squash from animals gradually decreased. The fruits became larger, thicker, and more edible. But squash offered more than just food. Its thick rinds could dry into strong natural containers. Long before pottery was widespread, dried squash shells could be used as bowls, ladles, storage vessels, or even musical rattles. In many ways, squash was not just a crop, it was a tool. As early agricultural communities grew, squash became a dependable companion in the first farming systems of the Americas. Farmers learned that squash vines spread across the ground in wide leaves, shading the soil. This natural ground cover helped retain moisture and suppress weeds. Eventually, squash would become one of the famous three sisters crops of indigenous agriculture: maize, beans, and squash. Each plant supported the others. Corn grew tall and provided a structure for climbing beans. Beans enriched the soil with nitrogen. Squash spread across the ground, protecting the soil and conserving water. Together, these crops formed one of the most successful agricultural systems ever developed. Over thousands of years, indigenous farmers created an incredible diversity of squash varieties. Some were grown for their sweet flesh, others for their nutritious seeds, and some primarily for their durable shells. From these early domesticated plants emerged many of the squashes we know today: pumpkins, gourds, and varieties such as cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita maxima, and Cucurbita moschata. These plants spread far beyond their original homelands. Trade networks carried squash seeds across North America into the Andes and eventually throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. By the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, squash was already one of the continent's most widespread and essential crops. After contact, squash traveled even farther. European explorers carried the seeds back across the Atlantic, and within a few centuries, squash and pumpkins were growing in gardens across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Today, squash is grown on every inhabited continent. It appears in countless dishes, from soups and roasted vegetables to breads, pies, and stews. Yet behind these familiar foods lies a story that stretches back thousands of years. The domestication of squash was not a single discovery or a sudden invention. It was the result of countless seasons of observation, experimentation, and care by indigenous farmers who slowly transformed a wild, bitter vine into one of humanity's most versatile crops. What began as a humble wild plant crawling along the forest floor became a cornerstone of agriculture across the Americas, and eventually across the world. And like many of the crops we depend on today, its story reminds us that agriculture itself was not born in laboratories or modern farms. It was born in ancient fields, tended by patient hands thousands of years ago.